thank you, Ed, and welcome, Chief Diaz.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for saying yes. I'll note you have had actually a busier day than even I had thought, because I think all of your days are busy in the city of Seattle. But as the way of introducing you right now, I will say you and I know each other from my time in the city of Seattle and working both in Southeast Seattle but also citywide. You've been with the department for a number of years, you will tell me. I know it's more than 20 years.
26.
26 years. And today you were sworn in.
I was.
We didn't actually know that at the time when we invited you. We couldn't have known that. We knew that you were the interim chief. We knew that you were going to be nominated to be chief. But it's really lucky for us, and we're grateful that you are spending this evening, this part of your evening, and that we know that you have another part of the city to be in after this as well.
Yes.
You were sworn in. There are a lot of folks who have no idea what that looks like. What does it look like when a chief is sworn into their position?
So typically you go through a pretty extensive national search. You get narrowed down to 3 candidates, and then you go through an interview process. At that point, the mayor then interviews you, and once selected, I was actually nominated by the mayor to be the permanent chief September 20th. And then I went through my confirmation process in around December 13th. And that's multiple questions from City Council. And then they vote as a whole on January 3rd. And then from that day, I then get a date selected to then get sworn in by the mayor. And I then had my son, my oldest son, pin my badge on me. And so it has been an interesting day to then get kind of announced into the department. But I've been the chief for about 2.5 years, 2 years, 5 months. And as I told the mayor, 125 weeks, 882 days, but who's counting? And, obviously it's been an exciting run.
We'll unpack what exciting means in a little bit, because we will get into some of the things that also drew us to wanting to talk with you about policing in not just the 21st century, but in Seattle and post-2020. I'm going to back up for just a second, though. Where did you grow up? Who are your people?
Yeah, so I actually grew up, I was born in Santa Ana, California. My family comes from what they call Logan Barrio. My family roots are from Michoacan and from Jalisco, Mexico. So my family has worked, they've worked in the fields, they've worked on the train. So we've seen a lot over the course of our family history. And eventually we lived in Anaheim for a little bit. During my high school years, I actually came up, I had a little bit of trouble in my high school years, and I came up to live with my grandma, and the rest has been history. So I've lived up here since 1991, and I've actually enjoyed the city.
Was that Seattle? You came up to Seattle?
Seattle area, but yeah, Seattle area. So,
if somebody had asked you when you were 13 what you wanted to be when you grew up, what would you have said?
It would never have been a police officer.
Yeah.
I can tell you that right now. It's fascinating of how you evolve and how you change. It wasn't that, like, my family history wasn't saying that cops were bad or anything, but there was a lot of family history that I had actually cousins that have killed cops. I actually have a lot of family history of just more into the gang activity. I have one that's kind of more into the biker gang activity and one more of the street gang activity. So it's been a very unique experience just growing up. And then my parents have always done a really good job of trying to keep us away from that kind of lifestyle, that type of activity. But my dad actually served in the military prior to me being born, and he actually had some special assignments into working in some federal agencies that do like the CIA, and so he had a different experience prior to mine. And so you always kind of know that sometimes policing is in your background. My brother, who is about 6 years older than me, actually started into the Seattle Police Department 3 years before I did. And he actually served, he retired this year after 29 years. He was a lieutenant. And since he's an older brother and I actually beat him on rank, you get to rub it in a little bit. But he was actually, before he left, was in charge of commercially sexually exploited children unit, and obviously that's something that people face every single day, human trafficking, sex trafficking. So very, very difficult cases. And then coupled with my 26 years, when you start to look at our family history, we have over 55 years of law enforcement background just in my immediate family. But it wasn't something I grew up in thinking that this is what I was going to end up going into. It just ended up happening.
How'd you get there then? What got you to policing?
Actually, I took a test in LA. My friend actually dared me to take a test with LAPD. To be honest, the words that came out of my mouth was, any moron could pass that test. I did pass it, he didn't. Lo and behold, I actually went through the LAPD process. I was given an academy date. I actually tested the process with Seattle. I was given the same academy date, and I stayed with Seattle.
Huh. What was your first assignment after you, well, I'll just ask, what was your first assignment?
I actually worked, my very first assignment was South Precinct. So in the FTO, in your field training officer phase, you actually just right off of Myrtle was my first precinct, and worked here for just 1 month. Then I came back out of my FTO phase and finished out my field training officer phase. And then I was officially assigned into the West Precinct. So I worked downtown for about 8.5 years in a variety of different units.
So 26 years ago, you may have just said your first year. What was your first year would have been?
97, 98.
97, 98. And so in the southeast area, 97, 98, the weed and seed arguments are in full force. And a lot of people may not recognize what that is. It was weed and seed, if you want to.
You weed out crime and you seed it with different social services.
Yeah.
So they called it weed and seed. And there was a lot of federal dollars coming in for these programs. So you did have a lot of enforcement that was part of it, because you were weeding out a lot of the criminal element and then trying to figure out how do you infuse community into those discussions.
So you ended up with a lot of people saying, well, we see the weeding, we don't see enough of the seeding. Mm-hmm. And so you're a young officer. You're a young officer of color coming into the southeast community, and kind of just, and there are some strong, very amazing and effective advocates who are still active from the 1990s.
Yeah.
You must have had some interesting experiences kind of figuring out for yourself what's going on.
Yeah, I think when, between this area, so I patrolled in and around the South Seattle and as far as West Seattle. Obviously, two different areas to police and patrol. West Seattle is a different dynamic than even the South Seattle area. And that was all one precinct. They didn't have the Southwest Precinct, which they do now. But you still had areas like Holly Park that were, low-income housing. You had High Point that also had, and they would call them projects back then, and nowhere near what they are today, and all that's been knocked down. But it wasn't much different than what we're experiencing, even the type of violence that we experience today. They had a lot of shootings, a lot of violence that was still occurring in and around that time. We actually were, we hit this year about a 27-year high in homicides. And so you could just imagine when I first started just how many homicides were occurring. It's almost a mirror to where I'm starting out as the Seattle Police Chief as well.
That has to be both great because you've got the experience, but also a little dismal, oh my God, it's gone up, rather than us as humans figuring out how to go the other direction with it. You and I have a little bit of overlap as well with some work with the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, separate from our professional roles. You work a lot on this, and we'll jump back in a little bit to the career things, but we went this direction. So what are you seeing generally people say, oh my God, so many guns out there, why so many guns? But I hear that, and then people are like, wait a minute, it's not a rhetorical question. Why so many guns? What happened?
Over the last probably 5 years, there's been such a huge influx of people purchasing guns, and for a variety of reasons. And I think we saw a massive uptick in the amount of license from Trump's administration, people purchasing a lot of guns. I think there was actually an article that says even some of the blue states that there's a lot more guns that are being purchased. how that's actually affected. So, I'm going to bring in just a little bit of a staffing issue. About 4 years ago, we were actually probably at our max staffing, which is in 2019. We had about 375 more officers. We actually lost 525 over the last 3 years, but we hired people, so we had about 375 more officers than we have today. But this last year in 2022, we will have recovered almost the same amount of guns. We will actually surpass the amount of guns that we recovered in 2019, and we will actually be almost on projection to be the #1 year over the last 12 years in gun recovery. And that's with 375 less officers. So obviously that's a huge concern, the amount of guns that are being recovered, because you have that many less officers. But then I also want to say it's very good police work that our officers are doing, because they're recovering a lot of guns that could easily be used for a lot of violence. And when you think about, so roughly so far this year, about 1,260, that's 1,260 guns that were recovered. But you don't just look at the guns being recovered, you actually have to look at casings that are recovered. And so we actually had almost about 3,400 casings that were fired in a city. And that's what's really more traumatizing to me, because each of those casings could have easily resulted in a death. And when I started doing some tracking of casings about 4 years ago, we were well into the low 2,000. So you almost are looking at about 1,400 more casings over the last several years that are coming out. And I just had a shooting at the very front end of this year, or just actually a couple days on Monday, and in around Northgate, 50 rounds being fired. And not just handgun type rounds, we're talking about 7.62 and 2.23 rifle rounds. And
those are big, fast guns.
Well, and they're going to go through walls, multiple walls.
Yeah.
So it's not, when that round gets fired, it isn't just like I can duck and I'm going to be safe. It's going through 2-3 walls, and it could cause a lot of damage. And luckily it didn't cause death, but I mean, that it does create the trauma in the community like no other. So
I'm going to divert back to a little bit, back to kind of, you brought up kind of post-2019, which brings us to 2020.
Yeah.
And since we're in a short time period, I'm going to jump over a whole lot of other questions that I would love to ask about your early career. But let's jump to 2020, because 2020, a lot happens in 2020 for individuals. We're in pandemic, a lot happens. But the murder of George Floyd happens. Mm-hmm. And I am curious about a couple of things related there. One is, I'm always a little curious how law enforcement officers recall themselves feeling when they saw the video or heard about the whether it's a radio broadcast or saw the video. And I'm curious, do you recall when you saw the video, and how was your reaction? What did it prompt for you?
Yeah, actually, after George Floyd, it was the first time I seen law enforcement officials actually immediately decry the issue of what happened. I mean, it was in the level of disgust. And I know Chief Best had publicly pushed out some social media. It was a time where people just did not believe that was right. And no one at that time, most police chiefs kept quiet about when an incident happens in another area. They typically just say, I don't know all the circumstances, I'm not going to say anything. But actually within a day, people were actually tweeting and sending out messages that this is not right. And it spread. And you have a COVID pandemic, so people are in their home, they're experiencing this information and they're digesting this information, and it ended up, initially we didn't think, it's going to end up coming over to Seattle because it was in another city, and I think that just left us this unsure and uncertainty about what was actually ahead for us in Seattle.
That's a great sort of transition then into, it did come to Seattle, it came
Mm-hmm.
everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think in combination with other videos, other issues that had been coming up, issues related to no-knock warrants, terrible cases, places. And so summer of 2020, I know that some of this, there are things that are under litigation that I'm not asking about. What was your role in in how Seattle Police was operating in the summer of 2020. Like, what were you doing on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so I actually oversaw a collaborative policing bureau, which had crisis response team, had community outreach. We were actually developing the community service officer program. So most of my work was all based in community work. We actually had what we call alternative response team. They do work in some of the homeless work that they're doing. And then obviously I spent a lot of time with Chief Carmen Best. We are really good friends to this day. We talk pretty much on a daily basis. And so I spent a lot of time with her during that time as well. So, but as far as operational, I didn't have any operational components of it until late into July for one weekend, while everyone was on vacation. I ended up taking over, and then August 12th, I took over as the interim chief.
In that summer of 2020, as everybody, for folks who may not remember, but widespread protests and sustained, sustained through downtown, intense, and then moving into other parts of the city, the Capitol Hill area and all of that. And I'm somebody who, and you would have been with the department at the same time, but some folks are familiar with Seattle's experience with the World Trade Organization protests and what was originally kind of parading through downtown. Initially, I remember we were parading in back of people in sea turtle costumes and everything. That turned very different. And Seattle ended up learning some very hard lessons, and in some ways became a national leader in trying to figure out how do you accommodate a large event like that. And then X number of years later, we have, I guess I could count those number of years, 2020 to 1997. But we ended up, in a lot of ways, feeling like maybe we didn't learn as much from WTO, or those lessons were lost in some way, or weren't passed down in the next generation of officers. Yeah,
so, when you start to look at it, actually, when I came on, in order to learn the Seattle's streets, we actually learned an acronym. Jesus made Seattle under protest, and it was James Street, then Cherry Street, Columbia, and so all of the downtown streets had a kind of this acronym. So we knew that this city, coming into this city, protest is just something that happens in Seattle, and so WTO was one experience early on, and I was a part of it because that was my district. It was Nike Town. Literally that was the heart of my district, and that's really when it kind of kicked off. The windows being broken and some of the violence occurring, and then all the way up into Broadway and Capitol Hill. But over my course of my career, we've experienced quite a bit of other stuff. We had Mardi Gras riots where Christopher Kime was killed. We had LEIU, which was a kind of a law enforcement intelligence conference. So we've had just different experiences over the course of my career, even 20-some years. But most of that was never designed, it was never targeted at the police department. It was typically a protest, like even in WTO, it's the World Trade Organization, it's, whether it's fur, whether it's different, manufacturing, all of the dynamics of that protest wasn't necessarily police related. Sometimes in some of those aspects, we end up finding ourselves causing it to be focused on police in the end. And where George Floyd was a different dynamic, it was focused on police. That we knew that there was issues between race and policing issues, and because you had Ferguson not too long, not maybe 5 years before. But even before that, you had what are the protests that occurred in around New York? We had them in our area, but it wasn't. They were around Wall Street, Occupy. And but again, it wasn't necessarily police focused. And so this was kind of the first dynamic of really it really hitting us in a different manner and really not being prepared in that dynamic. And so we've actually when I took over as a chief, I had to completely change the dynamic of what we're doing. So immediately I brought everybody in, and people that, some of our commanders that were leading it, finding themselves kind of doing the same thing over and over. And I said, look, let's just, I just take, I always say temperance, so kind of taking a tactical pause. Let's just take a second for us to really look at what we're doing. And I actually set on a path or a course to create a community response group that was literally going to train daily. They were going to focus their efforts on how we could actually reduce the amount of force that we were engaging into the protests. So since September 26th of 2020, we weren't using any what we call blast balls in response to crowd management. And since October 3rd, we didn't use any FN 303s, which is also a targeted, less lethal type of round. And so we've gone a couple years, but it took me about a month or so, month and a couple weeks to literally refocus our effort and how we adjust ourselves into how we manage crowds.
And if I can ask, so with policing, you have a hierarchy. I don't know that paramilitary organization is still the term that's correct, but there's a chain of command. There are orders that are given. So as you're training people and saying, we're going to do this in a different way, if everything goes well, everybody's like, yes, we are part of an organization, and everything gets passed down to the next person, or is that how it went, or was there some pushback about, you have got to be nuts that we're not going to use blast balls? What are you talking about?
Well, and actually, I still gave them authority if we needed to use it, but I really gave them the authority to really think about how they can do something different, that they're not having to use that type of equipment. And they changed it. They actually created their own matrix, how they were going to respond, how they can kind of create this distance from some of the groups when they needed to, because they didn't want to be the center of it. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to end up finding yourselves engaging because somebody's going to get hurt, and some of our officers got hurt, and so the people that we're dealing with get hurt, and so they found themselves actually trying to find solutions to actually address the issue, and that's what you want as a win when you're the chief is that, like, let's come up with something completely different and see what we can actually solve some of these issues out of it, and we did, and since then it changed the dynamic of how we end up handling it. We saw less protests, we saw less engagement, we saw less use of force, and that was actually many of the wins that we've been able to produce over the last couple of years.
That's helpful, thank you. I'm going to quote, when Chief Best retired, there was a Black Lives Seattle King County statement that said, directed at the City Council, "We demand the Seattle City Council stop prioritizing performative action that solely suggests the appearance of change. We demand transparency and accountability for the series of actions and inactions that led to Chief Best's resignation. And we demand a successor that serves Black lives." You got sworn in as the successor today. So do you have is there a relationship that you maintain, or is, I have to admit, I should have researched this a bit beforehand, but what is that state of a relationship with the Black Lives Matter Seattle King County crew? How is that relationship for you as the chief of police?
I've actually had, because of my probably years of outreach and experience, I mean, I've done this for so long in communities of color. Like I've focused my efforts on, working on youth violence prevention issues, demographic outreach. It's kind of interesting. Prior to this job, I was actually going to University of Washington, and I was majoring in American ethnic studies, Chicano studies to focus on. And so never did I think that was actually going to be applied in my head into this line of work. I didn't think I was going to be a police officer. So then you learn all sorts of race issues. And then growing up as a young Latino in Orange County, experiencing a variety of different things in that, to then now be up here as the chief, like, I've taken a lot of that experience that I had, a lot of even just understanding the distrust and mistrust with police issues. And I could talk, back in the day, my family would talk about the Zoot Suit riots, and because my grandpa was involved in that. We could talk about some of the history of being part of deportation, and because there were immigration issues, and at a time where literally, people were, some of these like ITT Tech would, they were doing piecemeal work, and then they would get raided out, and some of our family would get deported, even though they were actually born in the States. So there was a variety of different things that I think in my head, like how do I address these issues? How do I bring stuff into my forefront as a police chief to figure out how do I change policing? And And so all of this comes into the effect of where George Floyd is, to now my style of leadership of what I actually want to get out of this department and how I want to actually lead this department. You know, all the relationships in the community groups, BLM, Urban League, I've had those well established. In fact, I ran many programs with many of those groups, whether it was on critical incident response, it was, you know, trying to keep kids from getting shot. And so I've already had those development of those relationships. And that to me is what some of the benefit that I'm trying to get our officers to understand about how important it is to be actively engaged in community. And we're actually running a new program that is first of its kind in the nation. It's called SPD Before the Badge. I was talking to, I obviously spent a lot of my career of just understanding about like community, but I was talking to commissioners from London, Netherlands, New Zealand, and and even Peru. You talk to them, their academies are 1 year to 3 years long academy.
Wow, really?
And, yeah.
Holy cow.
And they don't give them a gun.
Yeah.
And our academy is 4.5 months, and we give them a gun hoping for better outcomes. Like, it's just not possible. It's just not possible. And so when I looked at that, you know, creating a program that said, look, like, I value us learning how to engage community at the front end. So we built a 6-week program, and it can expand, it can contract, depending on what we're trying to do. But I wanted to include social emotional learning and brain development, because I saw that the schools were actually doing a lot of teaching in this area because they're dealing with kids that are in trauma every single day. And so I wanted to know where our officers are at when they respond, or when they're actually coming into work. I want to know where they're at when they come to work. Are they in a good place? Are they in a good state of mind? Because if I have a healthy officer, I will have healthier outcomes. And so we included that. And really it is also bent on wellness, right? Growth and outward mindset. But then I also included listening sessions with community members. I actually had used a lot of our community contacts to actually teach classes on Black history, teach classes on Native history, teach classes on Asian history. So that way our brand new recruits are going to get this understanding of what it's like and why some of the communities might have trauma in the community. We started this in May of this year. It's already in our 17th cohort that we've already launched. And we're really getting, like, this is going to be a requirement for every brand new officer and even our lateral officers. So even if you come over from another agency, you're going to get this experience. And what I love about this is that the academy is really focused on training people to be guardians and not warriors. The problem is if you're grading people on the same things like use of force and shooting, defensive tactics, you know, driving, what we call emergency vehicle operations, and you're not grading anything on community contacts and building community, you're not really changing anything about training people to be guardians versus warriors, because you're still instilling them the same values, right? So if I infuse the community at the very front end, they give the concepts of guardian versus warriors, and on the back end, I do what they call a post-basic law enforcement time, which is about 2 months, and I continue to infuse the values that we want in Seattle. I actually get close to about 9 months worth of training. So when I feel comfortable that now I've given somebody a gun, I give somebody that experience of how to deal with community in a better manner, that hopefully that actually is much more responsive to the way we actually address community.
On the officer side, you've talked about the staffing issues. We've been joined by Chief Wilson, who's UW Police Department's chief. Staffing issues are front and center for Chief Wilson. You are known, even because you've been interim chief for 2 years, you are known for really standing up for your officers at the city council and other places to say, look, here's where we're going, here's who we're going to be. You're also known, though, for holding officers accountable, is how I'll phrase it. You've had a number of separations, I think is what we call it, in HR world.
24
separations.
Which is probably bigger in your police department, right?
Right now, yeah, right now,
So,
that's true. Can you talk about that? So what is the conversation inside the department right now with officers? Seattle, and I'll just give slightly more context and then I'll shut up and let you talk. Seattle is seen as not an easy place, or not a place that is perceived to welcome policing. That's a stereotype. That's a growing stereotype. It's a perception, and that's got to be a little bit tough for officers inside, but also recruiting and figuring out how do you attract those folks who have the mindset that you're looking for.
But I think that when people come to test for Seattle Police Department, they already know that city's dynamics. It's not like, hey, this is not a city that it is conservative. The city's progressive. When you come in to actually test, people kind of have this understanding that there is a certain level of dynamics. I think sometimes it is a little bit more eye-opening about how progressive the policing can be. But our officers learn and have adjusted, and they've done it a different dynamic. We've actually put a lot of things in place that actually have helped officers really show that they've actually been very, very professional. We have in-car cameras. We've had an in-car camera since 2004 in the department. We weren't shy of capturing what was going on with our officers. Every officer has had a body-worn camera for many, many years. It's actually a tool for officers because it actually shows their work, whether if they do something wrong, it's captured, and when they do something right, it's captured. And you look at across many areas, if you don't have that, it really questions about whether the officer did right or did wrong. And so we have those checks and balances. We document everything. Every crisis contact, every Terry stop, everything has been documented because we've been under a consent decree for about 10 years. So there's thorough documentation in the level of work we've done. And I do support my officers, and I do hold them accountable. I've made 24 terminations, and I'm not proud of that. But what I say is those officers made those actions. They did the thing that was wrong, that dishonored the badge, and I can't have them in the job. And I can tell you, it's probably more terminations than all my predecessors before me, almost all combined, because that's just the style that I end up leading. There's certain things that I'm going to hold true and hold my values to. But this is what I've seen. In 2022, our officers actually, we surpassed, all the way up until November, we actually surpassed the amount of arrests that we had in 2019 when we had full staffing. We recovered more guns than we had in 2019 when we had full staffing. So those are good markers. That means that my officers are going out and doing really, really good police work. But then I also look at the markers of use of force. We've actually, since 2022, compared to 2015, we put it in half. We had 2,000 cases in 2015. We had 1,000 cases in 2022. So officers are doing it with less force. They're making more arrests, recovering more guns, and doing it with less force. Then I think, okay, what about my professionalism? So then I go to my complaints. And our complaints in the last 4 years have gone down in half. And so officers want to know that there's accountability. They want to know that officers are going to be doing the right thing. That doesn't mean that we're going to be perfect. That doesn't mean that we're not going to have officers that have done something messed up, and but we are going to hold people accountable. And when you see that, you do see officers actually doing a lot more of the right things, and you see complaints being dropped. Doesn't mean that tomorrow you're not going to have an officer that's probably not going to be rude. I can't guarantee that. What we're trying to do is make sure that we try to eliminate that as much as possible. But we hire from the human race. And so then we looked at the body cameras, we look at the in-car cameras, and we make sure that we're able to show why we need to actually change that idea. So all of what we've actually been doing just in the last couple of years, and like I said, have had the luxury as being the chief for just as an interim chief, to really set my markers, very early on. And now then on permanent, I can actually show like these are actually really good things that we're doing. But we still have a lot of work to do, because I'm going to hopefully increase the amount of officers that I've got, and I've got to instill the SBD before the badge values, and hopefully that will really help change culture over the course of the next several years, and the direction beyond my time. So, because at the end of the day, I can only lead for so long, and somebody else is going to have to take over. But I've got to make sure I've instilled the culture of the department for longer than a decade.
Questions yet from the crowd for the chief at this point?
My name is Nathan. Thank you for coming out this evening. It's been very informative, and I think I can speak for all of us when I say we appreciate a lot of the changes that you've implemented so far, and we're excited to see what you have coming forward. One question I had to do with your new program, Before the Badge, and you briefly mentioned it, the city's consent decree. But has there been any consideration of expanding that Before the Badge program to existing officers to try and more rapidly change the culture there, or is this something that you are anticipating will take longer and be more of a phased approach?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I asked if the SPD Before the Badge will be something that gets infused in all of the department. There are certain courses that are actually being infused currently right now. So our growth and outward mindset are actually being done. There are some classes that we're actually including some of the brain development into. So yes, there is stuff that, there's hard for us to put 6 weeks into training because then I lose officers off the streets for that amount of time. But then the other thing is part of a broader initiative, what we call a relational policing initiative. And I'm actually I'll be hiring this year a relational policing coordinator that will focus on the second component will actually be doing a community mentorship for our sergeants, lieutenants, and captains. Because right now, to the earlier question that Sally was asking, I have a lot of community contacts. So when I go, like, we lose a lot of that knowledge, and it's not. So I have to make sure that I have sergeants, lieutenants, and captains that are actively engaging community. But if we can actually do a mentorship program, it actually benefits both the community member, they can ask questions about, like, why does the police department do this? Why is there a reason why, when they respond to a call, these things certain happen? But then it's also for that sergeant or lieutenant or captain to be able to know, like, I now have a community contact, and I actually can learn and understand members of the community that I might not have had before. And so that's the second component. And then the third component is really infusing it throughout your department. But if I look at it this way, say I hire 125 officers over the next 5 years. That's 600 officers, 600 plus officers over the next 5 years. And right now I've got about 940 officers total on the department. That's over half the department that's getting infused with this knowledge and basis of what we want to do. And so for me, the more we hire, the more we infuse it in different ranks, it is actually going to change that culture for the long term. Okay. Thank you.
I'm Lisa Nitza with Nitza Stegan. We're a developer, and I'm involved with a lot of safety and security initiatives in different neighborhoods where we have properties. And so I wanted to ask you a couple of specific questions. Really, there were three. One is parking enforcement going to stay in SDOT rather than coming back to you guys? The reason I ask, of course, is because it's a really major issue for anybody who's doing anything in SoDo, anybody who's doing anything in South Seattle. There is nowhere for RVs to go, and where RVs go is really problematic for a lot of property owners and communities. The second is the mental and behavioral health infrastructure that I'd love to know whether, I understand it really doesn't exist for your officers when they are trying to help people who have issues that need to be finding services and a place to go, and that we just don't have them. But I'd love to hear your opinion on that. And thirdly, I'd love to know how you're building partnerships with the social services organizations that are working with the unsheltered people on the streets every day. The Reaches and the KCRHAs and the Mid Ambassadors and the We Heart Seattles of Seattle. Perfect.
So the first question is actually parking enforcement. It actually has come back to the Seattle Police Department. So it just started at the very beginning of the year. There is going to be a transition period with SDOT and us. The senior deputy mayor and myself did the roll calls, welcoming them back just earlier this last week. So we're grateful to have them back, and we're going to have to support them in a variety of different ways. We actually are incorporating their work into the Unified Care Team, which is the work that does some of the unsheltered population work, including the RVs as well. And so that is going to be some of their work that they're going to be being supported by social services as well. And the second question was related to mental health and crisis. You know, every year we keep on increasing the amount of calls that we respond to and dealing with people in crisis. It's unfortunate that many of the mental health services are at capacity. I mean, when it takes a child to get 6-7 months mental health counseling services, we're in a bad place. And I was just somebody asked me the same question earlier today. I was doing an interview, and honestly, like as a state and as a county, as a city, we haven't put any of the investments that we need in mental health. But even if I said like I can hire 200 people in mental health services, there's nobody to hire, and that's also one of the issues. I met with the University of Washington School of Social Work, and they're trying to figure out how they also are able to get people, you know, trained and ready to go and getting the practicums that they can actually be able to help out in this work. And so I think that capacity needs to be expanded in some fashion, getting with colleges, figuring out how we infuse people into those programs, getting them trained and getting them out in the community. Because at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, it's going to be the police officer that responds. And so what I really have to do is make sure that our officers are really trained well in de-escalation services. In the 10,000 calls for service, we actually only use force in 1% of the 10,000 calls for service. So we're seeing this drop in decline because officers are really doing a good job of decline. Most of those use of force are what they call type 1 level of force, which is a very, very low level of force. I just actually pushed out a video of us responding to a situation where somebody actually came at the officers with a sword, actually legitimate sword, actually punctured through one of our patrol cars, but they handled the situation so well. And I want people to assure, like, until we build up the capacity of our mental health services, that people know that when we respond to those types of calls, that we're going to do everything we can to save a life. That we really are now trying to switch our mindset of just saying, like, our first goal is to not take a life, that we really need to figure out how we're actually going to get this person safely into custody and get them the appropriate services that we can. And I feel like some of that change is working. And I'm actually looking at new equipment. We've wrote up a policy. We've been testing out a new equipment called the Bolo Wrap. It's a string that literally goes around, and it might be just an extra tool for us to be able to use, again, to try and not have to use some level of deadly force in a situation that we could avoid from. When it comes to, I think, the third question was.
Is that the outreach groups?
The outreach groups.
With the community.
The social services
Yeah.
groups on the ground
Yeah.
that respond to things. How are you building partnerships with them?
So our alternative response team is actually working with the Unified Care Team and the Regional Homeless Authority, which all of the Regional Homeless Authority has all the community groups that you're mentioning, REACH, Just Care, etc. And so they're actually doing a lot of their own internal outreach to understand what programs, what are things that are available to them to be able to deal with when they're dealing with the unsheltered population. The alternative response is a group of officers that actually have pretty extensive community experience. In fact, some of them worked for me when I was doing community outreach, and so they're very, very good about talking to people, and really, they don't want to find themselves having to use force. In fact, they have that unit actually has almost like no level of use of force in the unit. So it's really a good unit that actually is really responsive to people's needs. In conjunction to that unit, the unit next to them, it's all part of the Collaborative Policing Bureau, is our crisis intervention team unit, our crisis response unit, I should say. And those are we have 5 officers with 5 mental health workers in a co-responder model. And so that is actually right next to them, sort of another resource for the whole department, but also for the alternative care team.
Is that team, is that crisis response team working just in the downtown area? Are they, are they
They're
geographically
citywide.
specific? They are,
They're
but there's only
citywide.
5 teams.
Only 5 right now, and actually we were initially at 1. When I ended up having the unit as assistant chief, I ended up expanding to 5. The problem is just the amount of officers. I'd love to expand it, but I need more officers to expand to then bring mental health workers in.
I'm going to tack on, because I
Yeah.
think this is a really interesting place to go, and you know, we end up being a part of these conversations where pretty much I think you get this from every major neighborhood. I shouldn't say they're all major neighborhoods. I love all the neighborhoods, but downtown, Capitol Hill, even Columbia City, U District in particular, everybody, and I think the city is having this struggle also about what is it that an armed police officer does? What is it that a mental health outreach worker can do and feel safe doing? And there are certainly advocates that would say, no armed officers ever. Most of the folks who actually work for the outreach groups are saying, well, actually, we kind of like the co-responder thing because we want to feel safe too.
Yeah.
But this scale is the challenge. And then also that conversation, every city, as we're researching it for what happens in the U District, pretty much every city is wrestling with this thing about what is an armed officer for?
Yeah.
And then I hear sort of rumblings about the world of officers saying, well, you know, we have jobs. I mean, we're important. We are serving a function here. Are people trying to tell us that we should be diminishing? Now, the abolition folks would say, yeah, we want you to diminish.
Yeah.
We want you to get out. And Seattle is a hot place for this conversation,
Yeah.
it seems like. You got plenty of people. What do the abolitionists, well, we could go any place with this. I guess one of my questions is, what do the abolitionists get right?
You know, obviously you want to make sure that you have a community-driven response. I've been lucky and fortunate enough to look at the South Park Action Agenda, be part of the Seattle Youth Violence Prevention Initiative, and a lot of those are community-driven initiatives. A lot of social work into a lot of social services infused into it, money invested into it to help reduce, you know, like youth violence or gun violence. So you do get those things right. But at the end of the day, there's also things that are elements that the police officers need to be involved and engaged in as well. So going back to this discussion between kind of an alternative response, we actually we took at all of our calls for service and we looked at what our final disposition is in those calls for service. And it's called the Risk Management Demand Data System. And what we did was about 11% of calls. So we just looked at every call and we said, okay, these are calls that only a police officer should respond to. Because it's dangerous, because of the type of elements that are associated with it, we don't think anybody else should respond to that type of call. Then we looked at second one, officer is the primary, secondary, social service worker. And then there's a whole slew of calls that are fit in that grade. The third criteria is that the social service becomes a primary and that there is a police officer as a secondary. So even as we look at the unified care team or the work in unsheltered population, the officer is there for sometimes security purposes, just allowing the social services to be able to do their work. Then the fourth component is only a social service base. And so it's taking those social service based calls and saying, okay, now how do we actually move this out of the Seattle Police Department and into a community-driven program, such as, give you an example, we have routinely, we respond to thousands of calls in dealing with person down calls. People that are passed out on the side of the street, okay? Fire department, I'm thinking, well, gosh, why isn't the fire department responding to that? Because typically they're medical calls. Person's passed out, it could be drug-induced, could be alcohol-induced, it could be, you know, somebody have an injury. But they give it to us because they can't send a big rig with all the firefighters on that big rig to that call.
Because then they're out of service for a
they're
period
out of
time.
service.
You have to shift over another section of the city. It's a complicated map.
Yeah, and so then we respond. We then look at the situation. We go, we need the fire department to come and respond, and then we call the rig out, and then, you know, but we assess it, we triage it. But should we be triaging it? Can we just have an EMT group that literally can say, okay, I've got somebody that has maybe they're alcohol induced, passed out. and now we just got to get them up to the hospital, or we end up got to find another alternative response program. But does the police officer need to be involved? If it's drug induced, we might need to be involved, because now if we end up finding themselves, administering Narcan or administering some sort of drug to wake them up, then what we find is then they start fighting. And now then you got to have the police officer there, because then you've got safety and security issues. So what that risk management demand does is it takes a data approach to it and says, look, let's just look at these calls and figure out how do we want to best respond, and how do we want to best use our resources, because not every call should be a police officer to respond. And so that's where we're actually going with it. And then this year, the City Council has funded the creation of a dual dispatch system. And that's one of the things that I'm currently working on right now. I've been really advocating for a new computer-aided dispatch system, which is when you call 911, it's what the dispatchers use, so that way they can get information out to the police officers. But having a system that can actually be able to actually dispatch out community members as part of it is unique. And only a couple of different systems actually have that ability. And so we have a company that we are working with that actually could carry out that duty. And that is something that would actually be something that is needed for us to actually be able to have alternative responses, to actually be able to flow in a much easier and smoother manner.
U District is ready to be your guinea pig area. We're ready. We are standing ready.
Yeah.
We could go on, like we just started talking about 911, which is really the crux of like all of this stuff, the dispatch system. And yet, we are pretty much at the end of our hour. Are there any final questions from out in the world here? I think I should say on the I'm going to get the words wrong. Risk demand management. The R&D.
R&D, yeah.
So you are an MPA holder from the Evans School, I believe. And I'm handing all of that to a capstone. I can't remember if they're a capstone crew, but I'm handing it as a project to a group of Evans School students.
Oh,
tomorrow.
are you? Okay.
Yeah, because we really are trying to think about this for the Seattle campus and for the U District at large. There are plenty of people who don't need an armed officer, but there are plenty of outreach workers that would probably like to be with an armed officer. We're trying to make sense of like, what does that look like for the greater U District? So I'm handing it to a team of Evans School students.
And there's so many, I'm actually, and with even a couple minutes left, we actually have a new program that we're actually doing that looks at disparities in real time. It's beyond innovative. No, I have this really smart scientist. The one thing I do that is really, really amazing is always find people that are smarter than you. If you're the smartest person at the table, you've screwed up somewhere. And so that which is now I realize everybody at the table is much, much smarter than me, and I just try to coalesce all of them and be able to digest it in my head. But we actually have an equity, accountability, and quality system that we built. It is a game changer. We can actually look at disparities in stops and frisks in real time, in a very, even tailored down to a very specific community. Because this is what happens. Community members will come, I'll come to a community meeting, people will say, can you clean up 12th and Jackson? Can you clean up 3rd and Pine? I want officers to go out and make arrests. And then we go in and make, before we make a whole bunch of arrests, and it was literally like anything that moved, zero tolerance policies, we're going to do that. And all of a sudden you see this high amount of people that are of color that are getting arrested, and it creates huge impacts. But we're actually taking a much more mindful look about how we do that. When people ask us, they say, hey, like I've got a lot of crime area, like how do we focus really on the players that are literally just doing or preying on the community, like those that are shooting, those are the infusing drug dealing, and we, even at 12th and Jackson, we actually focused on people that were literally using hotel rooms, but they were actually using tents to actually occupy to sell, a lot of the fentanyl in getting that into the community, and then also being part of shootings. And so we wanted to really, really target ourselves into those areas. But we actually have a system that can actually show us like, okay, officers are making stops, they're doing frisks, but now we can pinpoint to like, is there, if we use propensity score matching, which is stuff I learned even at Evans School, and it's just fascinating because you could hold for certain variables and really actually pinpoint to like, are we actually doing things that really asking questions, and how do we actually do this better, and how do we reduce the amount of disparities in our stops? And it's actually fascinating, and we're actually going to be meeting with our captains and actually having those tough questions about why does it look like this? Why does the data tell me this? And then actually look at, like, there are some areas where, oh, it looks like more people, the white people are being stopped in a very specific area. You know, what are the dynamics of that? Why is that, you know, why does the data look that way? And so we actually are taking all of our GPS data from all of our patrol cars, and we're actually being able to articulate whether it's you're over policing or under policing a community based on how they're patrolling in their daily response. And then the third thing of our EAQ is quality. We're actually taking all the body cameras and we're running them through a software system that actually can tell you whether you're escalating a situation or de-escalating a situation by just voice.
Wow.
And I call it, it's really fascinating because I say this is like, you know, I've been married 20 years, so I can say this now. You kind of have the 3 highs when you come home. There's a hi, honey, like everything's going well. Like that means that, like, I'm gonna be safe today. And then there's the high. It's like, okay, one of my kids did something, made my wife mad. I'm gonna have to figure out like what's going on. But you know, things are still all right. But and then it's the high, and it's like, okay, check the laundry, go up to the kitchen, start making dinner. What do I need to do? But you know, but you said hi 3 different ways, and you realize that like my officers can also say hi 3 different ways, but it's going to come off a certain way to somebody else. And so how do I figure out, how do I get to the point where we're actually really doing good de-escalation? And to the officer, like, oh, I said the right words. You did. But we also have to, you know, you have to figure out just the tones and different things. And so how do we then train our officers just better? And first of its kind, like there's no agency doing this type of work. But it's really what we're trying to get to. We're really trying to just build something in our department that is just going to change the way we do policing in this community. Like I said, it's not going to solve. We're not going to be tomorrow solving the issue. It's going to take us years, but it is going to be a game changer for us. So, thank you. Thank you.
Ed, are you wrapping us up?
I'd be happy to. Could you give a hand for Chief Diaz and Sally Park? And Chief Wilson, thank you for joining us. Another round of applause for Sally and Chief Diaz.